The massive chamber floated in the darkness of space like a jewel among the stars. Inside, 73 different species gathered in a circle that stretched nearly a kilometer wide. Each race had its own section with seats designed for their unique bodies. Some breathed oxygen, others methane, and some needed no air at all. The translation devices hummed softly as they converted thousands of languages into understanding. Ambassador Vexthor stood at the center podium. His body was made of living crystal that caught the light and threw rainbow patterns across the walls. He had served the Galactic Council for 300 years and had seen many young species try to rise too quickly. Today he would deal with another one, the humans. Vexthor activated the display above his head. Images appeared showing a small blue planet, then ships spreading outward like seeds on the wind, then colonies on 17 different worlds. All of this had happened in just 300 cycles. For the Council, where some members took 1,000 years just to cross their own solar systems, this was terrifying. He began to speak, and his words were translated instantly into every language in the chamber. Humanity had been discovered only 400 cycles ago, when their radio signals finally reached Council space. The observers had been amused at first. Humans were barely out of their own atmosphere, still fighting wars on their single planet, still dying from diseases that had been cured millennia ago by other species. They were expected to stay primitive for at least another 1,000 cycles. But humans did not follow expectations. They developed quantum drives without any guidance from advanced species. They built artificial intelligence that rivaled the processing power of the Zentari computers. They terraformed worlds and established colonies at a pace that made even the Korvathi expansion look slow. Worse, they did all of this without asking permission, without requesting membership in the Council, without following any of the established protocols. They simply expanded. Vexthor explained all of this to the assembly. He showed them graphs of human population growth, charts of their technological advancement, and projections of where they would be in another 300 cycles. The numbers were alarming. At their current rate, humans would have more colonies than the Heskari within 500 cycles, and more ships than the Korvathi military within 1,000. The chamber filled with concerned noises. The insectoid Heskari clicked their mandibles nervously. The floating luminari pulsed with worried patterns of light. Even the ancient Dren, who rarely showed emotion, shifted uncomfortably in their water tanks. Vexthor continued. The Council had seen this pattern twice before in its 10,000-year history. A young species develops quickly, expands rapidly, and then either burns itself out in civil war or becomes aggressive toward its neighbors. The Korvathi had been like this once, and it had taken 3 devastating wars before they joined the Council peacefully. The cost had been millions of lives on both sides. The Council could not allow this to happen again. Resolution 447 appeared on every screen in the chamber. The terms were simple and had been used before. Humanity would be placed under developmental supervision. Their expansion would be limited to 5-star systems. All new technology would need Council approval before implementation. Their military would be restricted to defensive forces only. Council observers would be stationed at each human colony to ensure compliance, for the good of galactic stability, for the prevention of future conflict, for their own protection. The vote began. Species after species approved the resolution. Some voted yes because they genuinely believed it was the right thing to do. Others voted yes because they feared what humans might become. A few voted yes simply because the Zentari Dominion had proposed it, and they did not want to make enemies of such a powerful council member. Only 8 species voted against it. The Talvari, who remembered when similar restrictions had been placed on them. A few small species who felt the council was overreaching, and surprisingly, 3 Korvathi representatives, who respected the humans' warrior spirit and thought they should be allowed to prove themselves in honorable combat rather than being contained like animals. The resolution passed by an overwhelming majority. Thor's crystal body flashed with satisfaction. He announced that enforcement fleets would be dispatched immediately. Humanity would be informed of the new restrictions and given 1 cycle to comply. After that, any human expansion or military buildup would be met with force. The Council adjourned, confident that they had prevented a future catastrophe. Far across the galaxy, completely unaware of the decision being made about his species, Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the CSS Defiance. His ship was one of humanity's newest deep space exploration vessels, equipped with quantum drives that could cross light years in days rather than decades. His crew of 45 people came from a dozen different Earth nations and 4 different colony worlds. They had just finished mapping an uncharted star system when Lieutenant Amy Brooks turned from her communications station. Her face was pale and confused. She had been monitoring the standard channels when an encrypted burst transmission arrived from Earth Command. The encryption was the highest level, reserved for emergency situations only. Jake took the tablet from her and moved to his ready room to read it privately. Commander Peter Hayes, his first officer and friend for 20 years, followed him inside. The message was brief, but its contents made Jake's blood run cold. The Galactic Council, an organization that humanity had known existed but had never officially contacted, had passed a resolution about them. Earth and its colonies were being ordered to halt all expansion beyond their current systems. A council oversight committee was being dispatched to review and control human technology. The human military was being ordered to disarm down to defensive levels only, and humanity had not been consulted about any of it. Jake read the message 3 times to make sure he understood correctly. Then he looked at Peter and saw his own anger reflected in his friend's eyes. They had discovered the Council 5 years ago through long-range sensors and careful observation. Humanity had learned that they were not alone in the galaxy, and that there was a vast civilization spanning thousands of worlds. The knowledge had been both exciting and intimidating, but humanity had not asked to join the Council. They had not requested aid or technology or guidance. They had simply continued doing what humans had always done since the first of their kind, looked up at the stars and wondered what was out there. They explored. They expanded. They reached for the next horizon. And now some council of alien species, who had never bothered to introduce themselves properly or welcome humanity to the galactic community, had decided to put limits on them. Jake made his decision quickly. He ordered Amy to open a secure channel to Admiral Catherine Wright at Fleet Command. Then he sent a priority message to every human colony in known space, calling for an emergency assembly of the Human Colonial Alliance. Back in the council chamber, Vexthor was already composing the message that would be sent to Earth. He wrote it carefully, using diplomatic language that made the restrictions sound reasonable and the consequences of refusal sound severe. He expected the humans to be shocked at first. Perhaps they would protest or argue, but ultimately he was confident they would comply. Every species did when faced with the full might of the Galactic Council. What Vexthor did not understand, what none of the council members understood, was that humanity had not spent 300 years clawing their way up from a single planet just to be told they had gone far enough. Humans had crossed oceans in wooden ships not knowing if they would fall off the edge of the world. They had launched themselves into space on controlled explosions. They had survived ice ages and plagues and wars and disasters that would have ended lesser species. They had not asked permission for any of it, and they had no intention of starting now. 3 weeks after the Council passed their resolution, 15 massive warships appeared in Earth's orbit without warning. They simply materialized in the space above the blue planet as if they had always been there. Each ship represented a different Council member species, and each one was larger than anything humanity had ever built. They arranged themselves in a perfect formation that spoke of centuries of military coordination and absolute confidence in their superiority. Commander Lisa Parker was on duty at Orbital Defense, Platform Sentinel-7, when the ships appeared on her sensors. She had been drinking coffee and reviewing routine supply reports when every alarm on the station started screaming at once. She dropped her cup and ran to the main control center, where Lieutenant Danny Cruz was already bringing all systems online. The readings made no sense at first. 15 massive objects had simply appeared on their sensors with no prior warning. No quantum signatures, no energy trails, no gravitational distortions. One moment the orbital space was empty, and the next moment it was filled with alien warships. Danny was running the sensor data through every analysis program they had. His hands moved quickly across the controls and his face grew more concerned with each result. These ships had used phase shift technology to arrive. They had literally stepped through dimensional layers to bypass normal space travel. Humanity had theorized about this kind of technology but had never seen it work. It was supposed to be impossible with current understanding of physics. The lead vessel began broadcasting on every frequency that humans used. The message filled every radio, every television, every communication device on Earth and throughout the entire solar system, even the old emergency broadcast. Systems from the previous century crackled to life with the transmission. The voice belonged to Vexthor, and it spoke with the absolute authority of someone who expected immediate obedience. He told the people of Earth that the Galactic Council had assessed their species and found them in need of guidance. Resolution 447 had been passed and would now be enforced. Human expansion would end today. Oversight committees would arrive at each colony within 1 week. Any resistance would be met with what he called enforcement action. The message played twice and then stopped. On Earth, in the underground command center beneath Geneva, Admiral Catherine Wright stood in a room filled with military commanders and civilian leaders from across the solar system. They had all gathered for an emergency session of the Human Colonial Alliance. Now they watched the recording of Vexthor's broadcast with expressions ranging from shock to rage. Catherine was a veteran of every major conflict humanity had fought in space. She had commanded ships during the Titan Rebellion when the mining colonies tried to break away from Earth. She had been on the front lines during the Mars Wars when competing nations nearly destroyed the Red Planet's terraforming efforts. She had gray streaks in her dark hair and scars from battles fought in vacuum and on hostile worlds. She did not look impressed by threats from aliens. President Henry Clark stood beside her. He had been governor of the Europa colony before being elected to lead the Human Colonial Alliance. He was a practical man who preferred negotiation to conflict, but he was not naive about the realities of power. He asked Catherine what their military options were. Catherine pulled up a holographic display that showed every human military asset in known space. 42 combat-capable vessels scattered across 17 star systems, defense platforms around Earth, Mars, and the major colony worlds. About 600 fighter craft of various designs. Against the technological advantage the Council clearly possessed, she admitted that humanity would lose a direct military confrontation. President Clark nodded slowly and asked what other options they had. Before Catherine could answer, an older man walked into the room carrying a small data chip. Dr. Colin Shaw looked like someone's friendly grandfather with white hair and smile lines around his eyes. But he was actually humanity's most brilliant scientific mind and the head of the Advanced Research Division. He had been working in secret for years on projects that even most government officials did not know about. Colin plugged his data chip into the holographic display and brought up schematics that made everyone in the room lean forward to see better. He explained that his division had been studying Council technology through long-range observation for the past 5 years. Ever since humanity discovered the Council existed, Colin's teams had been watching them with every sensor and telescope they could aim in that direction. They had recorded Council ships, analyzed their energy signatures, and built computer models of their capabilities. What they found was interesting. The Council was indeed far more advanced than humanity in many ways. But they were also stagnant. They used the same ship designs they had used for thousands of years. The same weapons, the same defensive systems, the same tactical approaches. They had stopped innovating because they had no reason to innovate. They were the dominant power in the galaxy, and no one challenged them. Catherine saw where Colin was going with this. She pointed out that humanity had developed quantum drives in only 20 years, while it had taken the Council thousands of years to reach the same point. Colin smiled and nodded. Humanity had compressed millennia of alien development into a few decades. More importantly, humans had done it their own way. Human engineering was built on different principles than Council technology. Human ships were designed for adaptability, for quick repairs, for creative problem-solving. They were built by a species that expected things to go wrong and had learned to improvise solutions. Colin brought up new schematics, and the room fell silent as people realized what they were seeing. Project Prometheus had been under construction in the Oort cloud for 5 years. It was built in complete communication silence with no transmissions and minimal energy signatures. The construction teams had worked in darkness at the edge of the solar system, where no Council sensors could detect them. It was a warship unlike anything humanity had built before. It was massive, nearly twice the size of the largest Council vessel in orbit above Earth. It had been designed using every piece of technology humanity had developed, plus several new innovations that Colin's teams had created specifically for this project. It had weapons, shields, engines, and computer systems that pushed the boundaries of what human engineering could accomplish, and it was ready to launch. Catherine stared at the schematics and slowly began to smile. It was not a friendly expression. Back at Sentinel-7, Lisa was receiving new orders directly from Admiral Wright through encrypted channels. Her eyes grew wide as she read them. Danny looked over at her and asked if they were really going to take aggressive action against a Council fleet. Lisa looked at the alien vessels hanging in space like predators circling wounded prey. She thought about what it meant to be human. Her ancestors had sailed across Earth's oceans not knowing what waited on the other side. They had climbed mountains because they were there. They had gone to space because it was the ultimate frontier. Humans did not kneel to anyone. Not to tyrants on Earth, and certainly not to aliens who showed up with threats and demands. She ordered Danny to bring all defensive systems online. She told him to load every missile tube on the platform. She did not care if the Council claimed they came in peace. Throughout the solar system, similar orders were being transmitted to every human military installation. The CSS Defiance and every other human ship was racing back toward Earth at maximum quantum speed. Captain Jake Morrison had briefed his crew and they had all voted unanimously to stand with Earth no matter what came next. Jake stood before his assembled crew in the ship's main bay. 45 faces looked back at him, representing every part of humanity's scattered civilization. He told them honestly that the Council was stronger and more advanced. Their technology had been refined over thousands of years, but technology was not the only measure of strength. Will mattered. Determination mattered. The refusal to accept limits that others tried to impose mattered even more. He reminded them that their ancestors had crossed oceans in wooden boats. They had flown to the moon in tin cans powered by controlled explosions. They had terraformed entire worlds and built cities in the vacuum of space. Humanity had always pushed beyond what others said was possible. He would be damned if some council of aliens was going to tell them they had gone far enough. The crew erupted in cheers and Jake smiled. Amy Brooks stepped forward and asked what the plan was. Jake's smile turned predatory. He told her they were going to do what humans did best. They were going to improvise. The Council's ultimatum expired at midnight Greenwich Mean Time. Admiral Catherine Wright had spent those final hours coordinating with every human ship and defense platform in the solar system. Now as the deadline passed, she stood on the bridge of the HCS Enterprise, humanity's flagship, positioned directly between Earth and the Council fleet. Commander Alex Turner called out from the tactical station that the Council vessels were moving into what looked like an attack formation. Their weapons were powering up and their shields were strengthening. They were preparing to enforce their will through military action. Catherine opened a channel to all human forces. She ordered them to hold their positions and not fire unless fired upon. She wanted the Council to make the first aggressive move. She wanted it on record that humanity had tried to resolve this peacefully. Vexthor's crystalline face appeared on the main view screen. His features reflected anger and impatience in the way his body refracted light. He told Catherine that her time had expired and that she needed to stand down immediately. The Council oversight teams would now proceed to Earth and humanity would comply with Resolution 447. Catherine looked directly at the alien ambassador and spoke in a voice that was calm but carried the weight of absolute conviction. She told him that humanity did not recognize the authority of the Galactic Council to impose restrictions on their development or expansion. Humanity had violated no laws, threatened no species, and interfered with no one's sovereign territory. The Council's decree was an act of aggression disguised as governance. Vexthor's crystalline body flashed with colors that the translation computers interpreted as fury. He told Catherine that humans were children playing with forces they could not understand. The Council had maintained galactic peace for 10,000 years. They would not allow humanity's reckless expansion to destabilize what they had built. Catherine replied that the Council should have invited humanity to the table as equals instead of trying to chain them like prisoners. That was their first mistake. Vexthor asked what their second mistake was, and his tone made it clear he expected no answer that would matter. Catherine smiled coldly. She told him the second mistake was assuming humanity would comply. She cut the transmission and turned to her crew. She gave the order to execute what she called Pattern Omega, Across the solar system, humanity's defensive plan unfolded with precise coordination. It was not about winning a direct military confrontation. It was about showing the Council that controlling humanity would cost more than they were willing to pay. The CSS Defiance and 12 other exploration vessels suddenly emerged from quantum space behind the Council fleet. They had circled around through the outer solar system and jumped in from an unexpected direction. They did not fire their weapons. They simply positioned themselves in a formation that put the Council ships between two groups of human forces. At the same moment, every defense platform in Earth's orbital space activated new shielding technology that Colin Shaw's teams had developed. Shimmering energy barriers flickered into existence around the platforms and around Earth itself. The shields were not as strong as Council technology, but they would make any attack on the homeworld extremely costly. And then from the darkness beyond Neptune, from the cold void of the Oort cloud where it had been constructed in absolute secrecy, the HCS Prometheus emerged. The ship was enormous. It dwarfed every human vessel and matched the largest Council ships in size. Where Council vessels were elegant with smooth lines refined over millennia, Prometheus was brutal and aggressive. Its hull was covered with weapon platforms, sensor arrays, and armor plating. Its engines glowed with barely contained quantum energy that made the space around it shimmer with distortion. It looked exactly like what it was: a warship built by a species that expected to fight against superior technology and had designed every system to maximize damage and survivability. Jake Morrison watched from the Defiance and let out a low whistle of appreciation. Colin Shaw had created a masterpiece of human engineering philosophy. When faced with a stronger enemy, humans built something bigger, faster, and more dangerous than anything they had made before. At the helm of Prometheus, Captain Nicole Grant opened a channel to the Council fleet. Her voice was steady and carried the confidence of someone who held the stronger position. She told them they were in human-controlled space. They had two options. They could withdraw peacefully, or they could learn why humanity did not need permission to exist among the stars. On the Zentari dreadnought, Vexthor's military advisors were frantically analyzing the new human vessel. Their reports were deeply troubling. The ship's power signature was beyond anything in their database. Its quantum drives were operating at efficiency levels that Council scientists had calculated were theoretically impossible. The weapon systems used configurations that made no sense according to established military doctrine. Vexthor stared at the tactical displays and asked how humans had built something like this without the Council's knowledge. His military commander, a veteran named Kreltoth who had fought in a dozen campaigns, suggested quietly that perhaps the Council had severely underestimated this species. Vexthor had to make a decision. The Council fleet was powerful and his ships carried weapons that had defeated entire planetary defense systems. But they were far from reinforcements, and this human vessel was an unknown factor. Worse, the humans had positioned their forces strategically. Any attack would result in significant casualties on both sides. And for what purpose? To enforce a decree against a species that clearly had both the capability and the will to resist. He thought about the Korvathi Wars centuries ago. 3 separate conflicts that had cost millions of lives before the warrior species finally joined the Council. The memory of those battles was still taught in Council military academies as examples of what happened when force was the first option rather than the last. Vexthor opened a channel to Admiral Wright. When Catherine's face appeared on his screen, he saw no fear in her eyes, only determination and something else that reminded him uncomfortably of the Korvathi warlords before they had been brought into the Council structure. He told her that they had reached what he called an impasse. Catherine leaned forward in her command chair. She told him there was no impasse. The Council had come to impose their will on humanity. Humans were simply declining that imposition. The Council was welcome to leave any time they chose. Vexthor said that humanity could not stand against the entire Council if they decided to bring their full military force to bear. Catherine's expression hardened. She told him that if the Council wanted to bring more ships, then they should bring many more ships, because this was humanity's space and they were not going anywhere. Not now and not ever. The standoff continued for 3 hours. Council ships maintained their positions while human forces waited with weapons ready, but not aimed. It was a test of will more than a test of military strength. Finally, Vexthor gave the order to withdraw. The council ships began phase shifting away one by one. Their departure was orderly and disciplined, but it was still a retreat. For the first time in thousands of years, the Galactic Council had backed down from a confrontation. Before his ship left, Vexthor sent one final message to Catherine. He told her this was not over. The council would deliberate on what had happened here. But she needed to know that humanity had made enemies today. Catherine watched the last council ship disappear from her sensors. Around her, the bridge crew erupted in celebration. They cheered and hugged, and some even cried with relief. But Catherine did not join the celebration. She understood that this was only the beginning of something much larger. She ordered her communications officer to get her a secure line to President Clark. She also told them to locate Colin Shaw. Humanity needed to accelerate every defensive project they had in development. The council would return eventually, and next time they would bring more than threats and warnings. On the Prometheus, Nicole Grant looked out at the stars through the forward viewport. Humanity had just drawn a line in space and dared the galaxy to cross it. She suspected the galaxy would accept that challenge sooner rather than later. But for now, for this moment, humanity had proven something important. They had shown that they could not be controlled or contained. They had demonstrated that 300 years of human determination and innovation could stand against 10,000 years of council authority. The age of humanity asking permission was over. The age of humanity as an equal power in the galaxy had begun. 3 months after the standoff at Earth, the Galactic Council remained in a state of confusion and internal conflict. The emergency sessions continued day after day with no clear resolution. The chamber that had once been a place of unified decision-making had become a battlefield of competing ideologies and conflicting interests. Ambassador Torvan of the Heskari, Unity rose to speak during one particularly heated debate. His insectoid form stood tall on multiple legs, and his compound eyes reflected the chamber's lights in complex patterns. His people had been forcibly brought into the council 300 years ago, and that history colored everything he said. He proposed that the council reconsider their entire approach to humanity. The word reconsider caused immediate reaction throughout the chamber. Some delegates buzzed with approval while others flashed colors of anger. Vexthor's crystalline form pulsed with fury. He demanded to know how they could reconsider anything after humans had defied a council decree and threatened peacekeepers with military force. Torvan corrected him calmly. He pointed out that humans had defended their sovereignty, something the Heskari had not been permitted to do when they were subjugated into the council structure. He used the word subjugated deliberately, the chamber filled with uncomfortable murmurs. Several smaller species began urgent discussions among themselves. The luminary pulsed with uncertain light patterns. Even some of the traditionally neutral delegations seemed troubled by Torvan's words. Vexthor insisted that the Heskari had chosen to join the council of their own free will. Torvan's response was measured but devastating. He reminded everyone that the Heskari had been given a choice between joining the council or being blockaded until their economy collapsed and their people starved. That was the same approach the council had attempted with humanity. But humans had found a third option that the Heskari had not seen available to them. Humans had chosen resistance. On Earth, in a secure communications room deep beneath Geneva, Admiral Catherine Wright was having a conversation that could change everything. The holographic projection showed Torvan speaking to her through carefully encrypted channels. The Heskari ambassador had risked considerable political capital to make this contact. Catherine asked him directly why he was reaching out to humanity in secret. Torvan's translated voice carried warmth despite coming through a computer. He told her that humans had done something his people could not do. Humanity had said no to the council, and the council had backed down. Catherine pointed out that the council had only retreated to plan their next move. That was not the same as accepting defeat or changing their position. Torvan acknowledged this but emphasized that the council had retreated at all. In 10,000 years of council history, that had happened only twice before. Once when the Korvathi fought 3 separate wars that cost millions of lives on both sides. And now with humanity, who had accomplished the same result without firing a single shot. Catherine leaned forward and asked what exactly Torvan was proposing. The Heskari ambassador explained that there were 12 species within the council who remembered their independence. These species had been absorbed slowly over centuries through economic pressure, military threats, or cultural assimilation. They were not slaves, but they were not truly free either. Their autonomy had been removed piece by piece, always justified as protection and guidance. Humanity had reminded these species that another path was possible. Over the following weeks, a secret network began forming across council space. Torvan and the Heskari made contact with other dissatisfied species. The Talvari, aquatic beings who resented council regulations on their ocean mining operations, joined the network. The Dren, peaceful traders who had been restricted to approved routes for centuries, added their support. Even some Korvathi military commanders who remembered their warrior culture and chafed under council peacekeeping directives began quiet conversations, but not everyone in the galaxy saw humanity as liberators or inspiration. Many viewed them as dangerous threats to established order. On the Korvathi homeworld, war leader Zarketh addressed his most trusted commanders in a private war room. The Korvathi were a proud warrior species, bipedal and covered in thick scales that had evolved for combat. They had served as the council's military arm for millennia, and that service was central to their cultural identity. Zarketh told his officers that humans represented a direct threat to everything the council had built. If humanity was allowed to continue their defiance unchecked, other species would follow their example. The carefully maintained peace would collapse into chaos and war. His second-in-command, a scarred veteran named Velkoth, agreed completely. He argued that the council leadership was too cautious and too willing to negotiate when they should be acting. Perhaps it was time for the Korvathi to remind the galaxy why they were feared. Meanwhile, the CSS Defiance was conducting a survey mission near the border of council space when they made a discovery that would prove crucial. Captain Jake Morrison had ordered his science team to investigate an uninhabited system that showed signs of ancient civilization. Dr. Laura Kim, the ship's expert on alien archaeology, could barely contain her excitement as she examined ruins on a dead planet. The structures were incredibly advanced, built with technology that seemed beyond even current council capabilities. But what made her hands shake as she worked was what she found preserved inside. She called Jake down to the surface to see something extraordinary. On a wall protected from erosion by some kind of stasis field, there were pictograms that told a story. Laura pointed to symbols she had already identified. That marking represented the Zentari species. That symbol was the Galactic Council's official seal, and those images showed something that the Council had never admitted in their official histories. The civilization that had built these ruins had been highly advanced, possibly more advanced than the current Council. And the pictograms clearly showed them being suppressed by multiple other species working together. The Council had not just found this civilization. They had destroyed it or absorbed it so completely that it ceased to exist as a distinct culture. Jake studied the images carefully. He asked if the Council had deliberately destroyed these people. Laura explained that it was impossible to know exact details from pictograms alone. But the pattern was clear. The Council found a rising civilization, determined they were a threat to galactic stability, and neutralized them. One way or another, these people had been eliminated. Jake immediately ordered detailed scans of everything. This was evidence that the entire galaxy needed to see. It showed that the Council's recent actions toward humanity were not unprecedented. It was a pattern of behavior that had been repeated many times over thousands of years. Back on Earth, President Henry Clark prepared to address the Human Colonial Alliance. Every colony, every major population center, every ship in the fleet received the broadcast. Clark had been a colony governor before becoming president, and he understood the fears and hopes of people living on the frontier. He acknowledged that 3 months ago, the Galactic Council had threatened humanity with restrictions and oversight. Humanity had refused, and many people had asked if that was the right decision. Some had questioned whether they should have sought compromise or accepted temporary limitations. Clark looked directly into the camera with an expression of absolute conviction. He told his audience that humanity would always prefer peaceful solutions and diplomatic dialogue, but they would never surrender the right to determine their own future. Humans were not children in need of supervision or guidance. They were a sovereign species, and they would be treated as such by any who encountered them. The broadcast was intercepted by Council monitoring stations and translated into dozens of languages. Reactions across Council space varied wildly. Some species found inspiration in Clark's words, others saw dangerous arrogance, and some, like Zarketh and his Korvathi warriors, saw a challenge that demanded a response. The galaxy was approaching a critical point. Lines were being drawn between those who supported the traditional Council authority and those who questioned whether that authority had become tyranny. Humanity stood at the center of this building storm, neither seeking conflict nor backing away from it. Admiral Catherine Wright understood that the fragile peace could not last. She reviewed reports from Colin Shaw about new defensive technologies and expanded production of military vessels. Humanity was preparing for the war that seemed inevitable. In her private quarters late at night, Catherine thought about her grandmother's words from decades past. The old woman had been a pilot during Earth's early space exploration, and she had told young Catherine that humans were the species who looked at the impossible and decided to make it possible anyway. Catherine smiled grimly as she reviewed the strategic projections. The Council was about to learn that lesson in the hardest way possible. Humanity would not be contained, controlled, or eliminated. They would stand their ground and they would defend their right to reach for the stars. The storm was coming, and everyone could feel it building across the light years. 6 months had passed since the standoff at Earth, and the galaxy was changing in ways no one had predicted. Humanity had established 3 new colonies in unclaimed star systems, deliberately ignoring the Council's original restrictions. Each colony was heavily defended with new weapons platforms and supplied through a network of fast transport ships that could evacuate civilians within hours if necessary. The Galactic Council met in continuous emergency sessions, but they were paralyzed by internal divisions. The hardliners led by Vexthor demanded military action. A growing reform movement led by Ambassador Torvan of the Heskari called for negotiation and recognition of humanity's sovereignty. The moderate majority wavered between these positions, uncertain which path would lead to stability. Then war leader Zarketh of the Korvathi made a decision that would force everyone's hand without official council authorization, and against direct orders from the moderate faction. Zarketh assembled a battle fleet of 27 Korvathi warships. The Korvathi were the Council's traditional military arm, a warrior species whose aggressive nature had been channeled into enforcing Council decrees for centuries. Zarketh believed the Council was showing weakness by negotiating with humans instead of simply crushing their defiance. He set course for New Horizon, humanity's newest colony in the Kepler system. The agricultural world had 8,000 settlers, mostly families who had volunteered to establish farming operations on the fertile plains. It was lightly defended compared to the older colonies, which made it the perfect target for Zarketh's purposes. Captain Jake Morrison and the CSS Defiance happened to be in the system conducting a routine survey when the Korvathi fleet arrived. His sensors detected the massive energy signatures as 27 warships phase shifted into normal space near the outer planets. Jake immediately moved his ship between the approaching fleet and New Horizon. His single vessel was completely outgunned and outnumbered, but he positioned the Defiance as a physical barrier anyway. It was a symbolic gesture that every human in the system understood. No one would harm their colony without going through them first. Zarketh's scarred face appeared on Jake's view screen. The war leader's scales were marked with ritual scars from dozens of battles, and his eyes showed nothing but contempt for the human captain. He told Jake that his intention was simple. Humans would abandon this world and return to their designated systems, or the Korvathi would remove them by force. The time for words and negotiations was over. Jake pointed out that this system had been unclaimed by any species. Humanity had broken no established laws by settling here. Zarketh dismissed this argument immediately. The humans had broken council decree, and that was sufficient justification. He gave Jake and the colonists 1 hour to begin evacuation procedures. After that, his fleet would begin their attack. Jake cut the transmission and immediately contacted Admiral Catherine Wright through the quantum communication network. He told her they needed reinforcements and they needed them immediately. Catherine's response was brief. She told him to hold his position. Help was already on the way. On Earth, Dr. Colin Shaw activated a protocol he had hoped would never be necessary. Project Lighthouse, humanity's quantum communication network, sent a single emergency broadcast to every human ship, every colony, and every defense installation in known space. The message was simple. The Council had moved from threats to actual military action against civilians. The response was immediate and overwhelming. From 17 different star systems, humanity's forces converged on the Kepler system. Not just military vessels, but civilian transports, mining ships, survey craft, and even private vessels owned by independent operators. Anything that could mount a weapon or act as a shield came through quantum space like a swarm of angry insects. Within 30 minutes of Jake's distress call, his lone ship was surrounded by 43 human vessels. Within an hour, that number had doubled. Mining ships that had been hauling asteroids now carried improvised missile launchers. Survey ships that mapped planets now deployed advanced sensor arrays to coordinate targeting. Civilian transports positioned themselves as shields between the warships and New Horizons' orbital space. And leading this chaotic armada was the HCS Prometheus. With Captain Nicole Grant at the helm, Nicole opened a channel to Zarketh that broadcast on every frequency. She told him that he was now outnumbered and surrounded. If he withdrew his fleet immediately, humanity would forget this incident ever happened. If he pressed his attack, he would learn why humans made poor prey. Zarketh laughed, a harsh sound that the translation computers rendered as pure mockery. He told her that numbers meant nothing against superior technology. Korvathi's shields were stronger, their weapons more powerful, their warriors more experienced than any human pilot. Humans were infants playing at war. Nicole's response was cold and precise. She told him that he was welcome to test that theory. She gave the order to execute what she called pattern chaos. What happened next would be analyzed in military academies across the galaxy for generations. The human fleet did not attack in organized formations like traditional naval forces. They did not follow predictable tactical patterns. Instead, they swarmed. Smaller, faster ships darted between the Korvathi vessels, forcing them to choose targets while constantly adjusting their shields. Mining ships released clouds of metallic dust that scrambled sensors and disrupted targeting systems. The Defiance and other survey ships used their advanced scanning equipment to identify weak points in enemy shields and transmitted that data in real time to every human vessel, and the Prometheus, along with humanity's largest warships, struck with precision at those identified weak points. But what made the biggest difference was humanity's unpredictability. A cargo hauler called the Sally's Pride, commanded by an independent operator named Chris Morgan, suddenly accelerated to ramming speed toward a Korvathi cruiser. His crew evacuated in escape pods seconds before impact. The collision disabled both ships but created a gap in the enemy formation that 3 human destroyers immediately exploited. A mining vessel commanded by Captain Diana, Ross used her ship's industrial cutting lasers to slice through a Korvathi engine section. The lasers had been designed to break apart asteroids, but they worked just as well on military-grade armor when applied with precision and determination. Throughout the battle, human ships maintained constant communication. When Korvathi forces adapted their tactics, human forces changed their approach within minutes. When the enemy deployed new shield frequencies, human engineers cracked the patterns and shared the solutions across the entire fleet. It was organized chaos, violence coordinated through hundreds of independent decisions rather than rigid command structures. Zarketh watched his tactical displays with growing frustration. His ships were superior in every measurable way. Their weapons hit harder, their shields lasted longer, their crews had centuries of combined military experience. But these humans fought like nothing he had encountered in 40 years of warfare. They were chaotic yet coordinated, reckless yet calculated. Then Admiral Catherine Wright arrived with the HCS Enterprise and the last elements of Earth's defense fleet. Catherine opened a channel to Zarketh. She acknowledged that he and his warriors were skilled and brave. But she told him this battle was over. Half his ships were disabled or destroyed, and more human vessels were arriving every minute. He could withdraw now with honor or be destroyed here with his entire command. Zarketh's warrior pride screamed at him to continue fighting. But his tactical sense recognized the truth. He had lost this engagement. His forces were being systematically dismantled by an enemy that refused to fight the way wars were supposed to be fought. He gave the order to retreat. The remaining Korvathi vessels phase shifted away. leaving behind 3 destroyed ships and debris from fierce combat. The cost to humanity had been significant. 47 people were dead, including the entire crew of Sally's Pride. Hundreds more were injured. 2 colonies had been temporarily evacuated as a precaution. But humanity had proven something crucial. They could defend themselves not through superior technology, but through innovation, determination, and an absolute refusal to follow anyone else's rules for how conflicts should be conducted. In the Galactic Council chambers, recordings of the battle played on every screen. The assembled representatives watched in stunned silence as human forces swarmed and adapted, as civilian vessels became weapons, as a species barely 300 years into space travel defeated one of the galaxy's most respected military forces. Vexthor stared at the screens, his crystalline form dim with something that might have been shock or might have been dawning understanding. Ambassador Torvan spoke quietly beside him. He pointed out that humanity would not submit and could not be contained through force. The only question remaining was whether the Council would continue treating them as a problem or accept them as equals. The vote that followed was closer than anyone expected, but the result was decisive. Resolution 447 was formally withdrawn. In its place, the Council extended an invitation for humanity to join as full members with complete voting rights and no restrictions on their development. President Henry Clark read the invitation to his assembled advisors in Geneva. Admiral Wright was there along with Jake Morrison, Colin Shaw, Nicole Grant, and representatives from every human colony. Someone asked if they should accept. Henry looked around the room at the faces of people who had risked everything to defend humanity's freedom. He said they would accept, but only on humanity's terms. They would join as equals. They would maintain their military forces, and they would never let anyone dictate how far humans could reach for the stars. The room erupted in agreement. 3 weeks later, Ambassador Lisa Parker stood in the ancient council chamber as humanity's first official representative. She had been chosen for her courage during the orbital defense of Earth and her clear understanding that strength and diplomacy were not opposing concepts. She told the assembled species that humanity accepted their invitation. Humans came in peace and friendship, but they came as equals, not as subjects. Humanity would contribute to galactic stability, but would not surrender their freedom. They would cooperate with all species, but would not be controlled by any. She paused and looked at each delegation with steady eyes. She told them that the Council had tried to limit humanity because they feared what humans might become. Instead, they had taught humanity that the galaxy needed more than stability. It needed growth, change, and the courage to reach beyond comfortable boundaries. Humanity was there to remind them of that truth, not as conquerors, but as partners. Vexthor, who had fought so hard to contain these unpredictable newcomers, found himself considering her words carefully. Perhaps the galaxy did need to remember those principles. Perhaps humanity's arrival was not a crisis but an opportunity. And across the centuries that followed, as humanity spread among the stars and shared their philosophy of constant innovation and determined exploration, the galaxy was indeed reminded. Some species welcomed the changes while others resisted, but none could deny the results. A renaissance of discovery and cooperation emerged that had not been seen in millennia. The Galactic Council had tried to control mankind. Instead, mankind changed the galaxy, and the infinite stars belonged to everyone brave enough to reach for them.